Swallowing babies has never looked so good. That's right, boys. We're finally talking about the changeling from the viewpoint of the mating manual. The first thing that we need to recognize is that changelings do not reproduce through traditional sexual means. There are only two ways in order to get a changeling baby. The first one is when a male or female changeling goes out, steals a baby somewhere, and then presents it to a female who will then swallow the baby. But when I say they swallow the baby, I don't mean that they just put the baby in their stomach. In fact, here's the airway, here's the food, and then here is the third track to the reproductive system that whenever they're getting ready to swallow babies or the cabans, that will open up and lead them to the actual reproductive system. And I can hear some of you saying like, wow, that is horrific, but you know, at least the baby's not in pain. Well, you'd be wrong because the baby's alive through this entire process. And in fact, if you noticed, back in the Eternal, there was an airway there. So this baby is literally being kept alive, but is paralyzed. And then over the course of several weeks, its skin and eyes will vanish. And then its skin and bones will start to break down, with the exception of the skull and brain. Keep in mind, the baby is alive. And then finally, the skull will reform around the brain and then complete its transformation into a caban. And so you may be thinking, what's up with these little things here? These are known as cabats. They don't actually form immediately after the caban is created. That's actually a little bit later in the process. And all this happens in the turvent organ. The turvent basically, once it's transformed the baby into a caban, then it will go and actually sit in the tail. And that's where the caban will actually start to form embryos on the caban. And these embryos are changeling eggs. And unfortunately, the baby is still technically alive and sentient and aware during these phases. But once a changeling embryo is ready to go, which is called a cabat, then it will actually fall off the caban, go down to the end of the tail, and for eggs, it'll actually go up the alpha tract, back into the cervix, and then it'll basically start to develop into a full-fledged baby. But once the caban has fully emptied all the embryos out and it has no purpose left to serve, it will actually get broken down, at which point the baby is put to rest. It'll go down, out the end of the tail, through the beta tract, and out the boop chute. But the other method for a changeling to reproduce is by gifting a female what is known as a cabat. The same thing that grows in a caban, but through a much longer process. So what changelings will usually do, and these are usually the males, it can be a female to do this, but usually males will go out into the world, find a disgruntled couple, disguise themselves as a man, woo the wife or girlfriend, and then, you know, get to fun time with them. And just lightly glossing over everything is they basically leave a residue that not only sits in the, you know, hot pocket, but actually whenever the cervix opens up for ovulation, basically everything kind of seeps in there and coats everything, and it attaches itself to the sperm and the egg. And when the baby is starting to develop, it grows cabats in its lungs. And this basically results in the baby being very, very sick and sometimes dying. But if everything works out, the baby will end up spitting it up, and at that point, the changeling will reintroduce itself, take the cabat, and leave. And 90% of the time after the cabats are out of its system, it will actually grow up to be perfectly healthy, no lasting side effects to the child. And in fact, a lot of parents just normally think that their child had, you know, a flu, a sickness, and then once the cabats are gone, then, you know, the baby got over it and they don't know anything more. The changeling swallows it, goes down the turvet, goes into the turvat, and then it basically does a reverse human baby and actually develops into a full-grown changeling. And once it's ready, kicking around inside of her guts, she ends up throwing it up, and then, whoop, you got a brand new changeling. The changelings often prefer the baby swallowing method is because each caban, if it's a normal changeling, can hold up to 10 embryos at a time. Royal changelings can hold up to 15. And for normal changeling women, they can only hold up to 2 cabans, but royals can hold up to 5. But if you go the other way, a child will only be able to really hold about 2 to 6 cabats. So unfortunately, numbers math in a certain way that makes changelings want to just go ahead and kidnap babies because they can get a lot more offspring out of them. And while yes, all this information will be in the mating manual, which you can see developed by grabbing a Ruby Gold sub, or getting an original character in the series if you really want to make the changelings pay, because we do have people who have made original characters that exist for the sole purpose of hunting down changelings because they believe they're parasites. And they would really like to see the worlds of my mangas, The Devil's Deal, and Night of Slaughter purged from the world. However, in Night of Slaughter, you do have Ullman, who is a changeling, surrounded by peers, which you can read all of them for free, just see buyer description, or you can always go grab a physical of the newly restocked. But my question is, after I looked in nature and saw how violent some of creatures reproduce, that was actually the inspiration for the changelings. But do you believe that as a sentient race, changelings have a right to exist? Because the only way they can reproduce is through the predation of another species. And this usually is strictly limited to humans and sometimes dwarves. And there is a very good reason they don't target dwarves.